one of the few times I have ever been recognized as a writer, which is not a thing that happens often. We live in Portland, Maine, so
Yep.
we have this crotchety old lobsterman at the far end of our road. He was on our jogging route. One day, my wife and we were walking as like a cool down afterward, walking past his place, and I hear, "You that Holm guy?" And I said, "Maybe." Why? He says, "Because I got this book out of the library, and I get to the end, and I turn to the last page, and I see the author photo, and said, 'Hey, that's the asshole who runs by my house.'"
Dave Bolger here, and welcome to Had I Known, conversations with interesting members of the Hamilton College community. This week's guest is Chris Holm, class of 1999. All right, welcome back to another one. This is episode number 65. Incredible. And the show keeps growing. And no, not in the ways I've talked about in the past. If you've listened before, you know that this is an international phenomenon, now heard in 62 countries. No, it's not just that. The Had I Known team has grown. I am thrilled to welcome Maeve Siebold and Devin Mendelson, both from the class of 22, to the Had I Known team. They have officially signed on to help make this show better. So they're going to teach me a thing or two, and I'm going to get to blame them when things go wrong. It's a win-win situation for me. So if you notice things getting better over the coming weeks, particularly in social media, you know that it's Maeve and Devin helping me out behind the scenes. So welcome, Maeve and Devin. All right, we got Chris Holm this week, class of 1999. Chris is an award-winning author. He's penned the cross-genre collector trilogy, Dead Harvest, The Wrong Goodbye, and The Big Reap. He's written the Michael Hendricks series, The Killing Kind and Red Right Hand, as well as the short story The Approach. Chris's work has been selected for the Best American Mystery Stories, been named a New York Times Editor's Choice, and he's won a number of awards, including the 2016 award for Best Novel. His new book, Child Zero, will be released May 10th of next year. And after you hear him talk about it here today, you're going to want to get it. And it's available now for pre-order. Link in the show notes for that. Chris is an interesting dude. It was fun talking to him about his writing process, how he got into writing, and some of his books. Now, he was kind enough to send me the first Michael Hendricks book, The Killing Kind. So I had just finished reading it when we recorded this conversation. And I think I probably did borderline fanboy out a little bit because I really enjoyed the book. And I felt bad making him go back and talk about a book that is now 6 years old. But in talking about the book, it was interesting to hear how he incorporates things into his writing, how he comes up with the ideas, in fact, how this idea came to him. It was really interesting. I've said before when I've talked to writers, I have immense respect and jealousy of people who do this. So it was fun to tap into his brain a little bit and hear how he thinks about things. So if you're interested at all in hearing about the process of writing, this one could be good for you. If you're a science nerd, as Chris says he is, but you're interested in writing, you're really going to want to check this one out. It's an interesting path that Chris took to become a successful writer. So check it out. Here's my conversation with Chris Holm, class of 1999. Off the bat, thank you for sending The Killing Kind. Loved it. It was awesome.
Thank you so much.
Really, really enjoyed it. It read to me like, and I admittedly I have yet to read the sequel, but certainly reads like a Netflix series. I'm like, I can't wait to watch this on Netflix.
Well, thank you very much. From your lips to Netflix's ears.
So we got to make that happen. How do we make that happen?
Well, funny thing about that, and this isn't something that's really all that common knowledge, but it was optioned right off the bat, pretty much as soon as it was released. And it wasn't my first go around with Hollywood. where usually they say a bunch of nice things, and you'll have one phone call with a producer, and he'll tell you how great your book is and how it's definitely going to get made, and
Hmm.
then nothing happens.
Hmm.
Um, but in this case, they've actually re-upped the option several times, and I am told um, feature film is going to go into development into production by the end of the year.
Hell,
So they have,
hell yeah.
yeah, it's terrific. It's
That is
pretty excellent.
awesome.
Yeah,
That
thank
is
you.
that is awesome. So when they re-up an option like that, you getting paid again?
Yeah, yeah. So options are a really goofy thing. Hollywood in general is just really goofy. But basically, the way it works is, they'll say, "Hey, we want to give you, you know, $25,000 for, a window of, 18 months during which we will try and get this going.
Uh-huh.
And if nothing happens by the end of that period, we can re-up it then. And typically, they're allowed to do like one re-up per your contract, and I think we're on three or four now.
Huh.
So it's taken some time, but it's really weird too because I hear the updates secondhand from my agent.
Hmm.
Um, so he's like, "Oh yeah, they're bringing in the people who co-wrote the script for Casino Royale," and you're like, "Holy shit!" And they're like, "Yeah, the producer hated that script, so they're going with somebody else." And it's like, I was fine, they can write my movie. I don't care. So yeah, it's strange. It's all a game of telephone, uh, and nothing happens until it does. But yes, they keep paying me for essentially no work, which is kind of excellent for a
Well,
thing I
that's that
already
that
did.
that's kind of the
Yeah,
dream
that's the dream.
situation.
That is the dream, right?
Well, that's exciting. I'm gonna be on the edge of my seat waiting to see how that plays out. I hope it happens.
Thanks very much. I hope so too.
I um I certainly don't know much about the industry, but as a fan, who is interested in sort of this behind the scenes sort of conversation,
Hmm.
the more I hear about it, like the story, like you're saying, it seems like it's a miracle that anything ever gets made. That so many things have to fall into place just right
You know,
to have it happen.
yeah, that's absolutely true. And I also think it's a miracle anything good ever gets made because you see so many. You'll see a great uh, a great producer options, a great book. They throw some serious talent at it. They get some A-list stars, and the movie's terrible.
Right.
So it amazes me. It amazes me that because I get to be the king of my own little domain when I write a book. Like whether it's good or whether it's bad, it's on me.
Right.
But the idea that you know 300 people can come together and make something that actually can come off as a cohesive vision is just mind-boggling to me.
And do you worry about that? Is when and if that does get turned into a, a motion picture or a series, whatever it may be, that your work goes into other people's hands, and I don't know how much control you end up having out of that. Do you worry about like your name associated with something? Well, that's not what I wrote. That's not what I intended.
Yeah, I mean, I think growing up, as a fan of books, I always got so angry on
Yeah.
behalf of authors when they got a
Yeah.
really shitty adaptation, and now I think I have a very different view of it. I think I'm trying to remember. It was James Cain, the guy who wrote "The Postman Always Rings Twice." Um, he Double Indemnity. No, he didn't do
Hmm.
Double Indemnity. It doesn't matter. Um, he was once asked, like, by a journalist, how do you feel about Hollywood taking all your books and ruining them? And he turned around and looked at the shelf behind him and said, "They look just fine to me." Um, so I've kind of come to realize that, like, if I want to make a living at this, if somebody makes a terrific movie out of my books, then I get the benefit of being able to say, like, well, I did all the heavy lifting. And if they make something shitty, then readers will just say, "Oh, the book was so much better." So
Right.
as long as
Right.
long as the check's clear,
Right. Right. That's right. You get paid either way. That's right.
yeah, we'll see if I can say the same thing. If and when I do get a terrible movie, a
Uh-huh.
buddy of mine who shall remain nameless, simply because publicly he's been very enthusiastic about the movie, recently had a movie um, come to HBO Max, and again, it had a really nice pedigree. He got a co-writing credit for the script. The guy who was one of the co-writers and director, is kind of a name. He's kind of a hot ticket item, major bankable star. And they turned a terrific thriller into just a garbage movie.
Huh.
Um, but on the other hand, I mean, you know, it still probably boosted his sales, boosted his profile,
Right.
and it doesn't
Right.
alter what the book he wrote, you know?
Right. Right. And then that just opens up a whole different world of or type of work, right? If you're getting
Hmm.
co-writing credit on that and opens you up to that world. I don't know if that's
Yeah.
something you'd ultimately be interested in doing, but it certainly changes the game and changes the scope of, what you call yourself and what type of writer you are.
Oh, absolutely. And I've seen some people level up in that regard. Like one of my favorite authors is a woman by the name of Megan Abbott, and her shtick, at least in the latter end of her career, she actually has a PhD in English literature with a specialty. She wrote her thesis on sexism in classic noir,
Mm-hmm.
and so she spent a lot of her career um, essentially updating noir and telling it from a feminist perspective, writing noirs in milieus you wouldn't necessarily expect. Her big breakthrough was a book called Dare Me,
Mm-hmm.
which is a really pitch black noir that takes place entirely within the confines of a high school cheer squad, and it's terrific. And she went through a multi-year process of developing it for TV. It ended up on USA. They only got one season, but it was picked up by Netflix that season for streaming, and was a modest hit, and a terrific show. And she's written, she's now written for shows like she wrote for David Simon's The Deuce,
Mm.
on HBO. So yeah, it's interesting. It's a lot of strange paths you can go down.
And she's a fascinating Twitter follow as well.
Hmm.
As
She is indeed.
and you're not so bad yourself, by the way.
Thank you. I've actually taken a few big steps away from Twitter in recent months. Um,
It's good for the
you know,
soul.
yeah, it definitely can be. I love the cocktail party aspect of Twitter. I love just getting to pop in and pop out and chat with friends. I've made a lot of great contacts on Twitter, but there's a certain level of toxicity there that there never used to be, or at least not in my social circles.
Yeah.
And yeah, it gets wearying quickly.
The line, the very thin line between fun, harmless snark and just outright, toxicity is a pretty thin line.
Yes,
It
indeed.
turns into a cesspool pretty quickly, but
It can. Yes.
but an addicting one at that.
Yes.
Just back to the book for a second. So when you sit down and write something like The Killing Kind, are you thinking about this conversation we were just having about what could potentially happen, or are you just focused on writing a good book and not worried about will this play as a motion picture or anything like that?
So I would love to say that I don't think about those things at all,
Mm-hmm.
but it's simply not true. When I to go back to the genesis of The Killing Kind, it began in maybe the most anti-commercial way possible. Um, I had my background is in science. I was a biology major at Hamilton, um, and I was working in a lab. I'd been there for about 10 years while I was writing on the side, and it was a small startup. This was during the economic downturn in the aughts, and we made a good go at it, but ultimately the company folded.
Hmm.
So for the first time since I was 14, I was out of a job. I'd never been let go from anywhere. I was completely just at wit's end, didn't know what to do with myself. Uh, and a buddy of mine by the name of Steve Weddle, who's a terrific writer in his own right, uh, emailed and said, "Hey, I'm thinking of starting a magazine, like a print magazine for noir, for literary noir." And he said, I there are a lot of great online outlets at the time. There were all kinds of places that were publishing stories online. And he said, but I want to do something for the people who don't want to read those short, pithy online stories. I want the big, crazy ideas that are better in print. And he said, I'd love for you to write something to anchor our second issue. He's like, the bigger the story, the better. And I was like, well, I had a couple of ideas that I was kicking around. And I
And were
said, I
you
haven't.
just and while working in science, you had Still, you had a passion for writing, I assume. He knew to come to you because you.
Yeah. So at that point, I'd had maybe 10, 15 short stories out. And I think
Wow.
at that, and possibly my first novel. So I'd been writing on the side for years.
Mm.
Um, and I'd met him through like the writing community online. There were at the time blogs and early. This was maybe before Twitter, but the now it's you have to have Facebook, you have to have Twitter, you have to have Instagram is what you're what the advice you'll see online when you're trying to secure an agent or get a publisher. There's all these things you have to do. Back then, it was you need your own blog, which
Hmm.
certainly puts a pin in a specific era.
Right.
So I'd met this guy. We were kind of like minded, and we'd emailed back and forth. We hadn't met at that point, and um, and I said, sure. I've got a couple ideas that are the sorts of things that, in as much as I'm known for anything, I'm known for. And I said, and then I've got this other idea. It's not even an idea. It's just a scene that played through my head as I was dozing off one night. Uh, and I always kind of run stories through my mind, and um, both of my current book series, the first one, which was a crime fantasy hybrid, and this one kind of came in that strange liminal space where you're dozing off at night. And the scene was a political rally in this unnamed banana republic, and I could picture this guy who had just triumphantly won an election with like 95% of the vote because he has, no actual opposition in this country, um, celebrating his victory. And the entire scene was kind of being watched through the scope of a rifle several stories above across this plaza. And at the time, I didn't think much of that. I was like, okay, it's some sort of political assassination. There's nothing that interesting going on. Um, I always harken back to there's a Mitch Hedberg joke where he said, um, I often think of jokes when I'm in bed, but I don't keep a pen and paper nearby.
I was just going to ask you if you keep a pen and paper
Yeah.
nearby.
And he said, so, when I have an idea for a joke while I'm in bed, I either have to get up and write it down or convince myself it wasn't that funny. And so for me, I was like, okay, this isn't interesting enough to go write down. Um, and so this character is sort of narrating this scene in my head, um, and he's thinking about pulling the trigger. He pulls the trigger, and I remember he said, 3 pounds pressure, no more, no less. And then the gunshot cracked like thunder throughout the square. And the guy who was behind the dais um, has a strong sense of self-preservation. He drops, um, but as the character said, it's too little, too late. By the time you hear the gunshot, the bullet's come and gone. Luckily, he's not the person I was aiming for. And then I just sat bolt upright in bed and was like, I don't know what the hell just happened.
Huh.
I think it was just that I was dozing off. My brain was wandering, and something peculiar happened. And I ran downstairs and just started writing down everything I could remember about the dream.
Huh.
And then a week later, my buddy says, "Boy, I'd love to get a short story from you." And so I pitched him a couple ideas, and he was like, "Yeah, that's fine, that's nice." And then I said, "And I've got this scene. I don't know what to do with it. I don't know where it's going, but I get the impression it's going to be this wild and woolly story. It's going to be longer and more elaborate than anything I've ever written." And he was like, "Yeah, that's the one I want." And so I sat down and wrote it. It turned out it was an 11,000 word story, which is kind of a short novella. It's not even really a short story at that point. Longest thing I'd ever written in terms of short stories. And I gave it to him for free. He couldn't afford to pay me. It was for the second issue of a magazine that didn't yet have a first issue. And I thought, okay, maybe 20 of our friends will read this and that'll be that. Several months later, I actually got a letter from a guy by the name of Otto Penzler, who runs a Mysterious Bookshop in New York and Mysterious Press, which is a crime imprint. And at the time, he was also in charge of the Best American Mystery Stories anthology that comes out every year. And it was actually from his assistant. And she said, we would love to include this story in our anthology. which is a huge deal. I mean, it's in every bookstore in America. It's
Hmm. Hmm.
it was a pretty legitimate thing. And she was like, "Oh, and by the way, we'll pay you." And I was like, "Well, that's terrific." I think the most I'd ever made on a short story was $200, and most of them in the blog era, you'd get, you know, $10 or a free T-shirt or something like that. And I was like, "Yeah, sure. How much do you guys pay for reprints?" And she was like, "Well, it'll be $1,000." And I was like, "Fantastic!" So it already turned out to be the most, lucrative short story I'd ever written.
Yeah.
Um, and then once my agent at the time uh, heard that it was going to be Invest American, she suddenly was very interested in the story and started pushing me to turn it into a novel.
Hmm.
Um, it was strange that she said that because the funny thing about that agent was she never really said much of anything to me. Uh, she did a whole lot of not selling my novels, um, and so I buckled down in between writing my first series, which was for a very small publisher in the UK. Um, but in between writing that series, I banged out the first draft of what's now The Killing Kind, um, and excitedly sent it off to my agent, and she promptly sat on it for 9 months without reading it.
Oh my
Uh,
God.
After which she told me that it was unpublishable, and said, I should really consider working on something else. Um,
Wow.
yeah, yeah. So that was, I mean, it was a bit of a blow. Um, the funny thing was, I had written it with the intent, like I'm gonna blow up this story and make it as big and, filmic as possible, and try and break out of, being on these small presses, and
Hmm.
having all 50 people who read my first three books seem to really enjoy them. But I was kind of hoping to break in and have a larger audience.
Hmm.
And I found myself realizing I had to take a leap of faith. I either had to shelve that book and get working on something else, or fire the only agent that I had ever had and go looking for a new one.
Yeah.
Um, and so that's actually what I did. And yeah.
And then what do
um,
you, so then you're just shopping it around yourself or shopping it to other agents, or what's that process?
right. So the process, and this is something that I had no idea about when I started writing. I didn't have any connections in publishing. I'd never taken a creative writing class in my life. I didn't really know who to ask those questions to. So I started reading, just instructional things online, agents' blogs, um, online writing magazines. And it turns out, if you want a mainstream publisher, the sorts of books you'll see, on the shelves at Barnes and Noble or your local indie, um, you typically don't shop for a publisher. What you do is you actually find an agent,
Hmm.
um, and an agent will shop the book around to publishers for you. You don't pay an agent, not a reputable one. They get a commission of whatever they sell. So it's like an agent in anything else. It's like an agent in sports, or
Yep. Yep.
uh, and and so if you don't have somebody who can give you an introduction to an agent, you do it just like you would find any job. You write a cover letter, which in publishing is known as a query, and then you submit your query letter, which is a short pitch of, here's what my book's about. um, and then they'll ask for 5 pages or a chapter or 50 pages. And I think for my first agent search, I think I sent out something like 100 queries, and I ended up getting 4 or 5 major nibbles and 2 offers of representation.
Hmm.
Um, and the second time I went to do it, I'd had a couple of minor awards under my belt, some some success with at least critically, with my first series.
Hmm.
And I think I sent out 5 query letters to like my absolute dream agents, and ultimately ended up um, signing with my absolute dream agent, a guy by the name of David Gerner. Um, and but interestingly, he rejected the book initially.
Huh.
He said, look, I think there's a lot of potential here. I think it needs a lot of work. I'm not ready to offer representation at this time, but not for nothing. Here are my notes. And he gave me 6 single-spaced pages of detailed notes about the book.
Wow.
And I started wading into them, and thought, oh my God, these are brilliant. These are really fantastic. He was a lot of agents come from editing, He was actually the executive editor at Doubleday, I believe. I hope I got that correct because I'll get in trouble if I didn't. But he was the guy who he made his career by plucking a then unknown John Grisham out of the slush pile.
Oh, I've heard of him. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And John's a client of his now. When John's first agent passed away, he said, "Hey, what do you think about becoming an agent and working for me?" And that's how David got his start in agenting.
Wow.
But yeah, he gave me some notes. I went back and forth with him a bunch of times on the book, just polishing it up. It's funny. It was David's a one more draft kind of guy. He's like, "Oh, it just needs one more draft." And I think we went through 6 one more drafts.
Wow.
But I remember I'd come back from a writing conference called Left Coast Crime that was in Monterey. And my wife and I had just taken a red eye back home. And we were wheeling our luggage to the car in the parking garage. And I just got an email that said, "It's ready. I'm sending it out." And I think 5 days later, I had a deal with Mulholland Books, who are still my publisher to this day. So it was pretty wild.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
And that one more draft sort of approach, does that fit your style or is that exhausting?
And both. A little bit of both. Yeah. So it's funny because my first series, I mean, I didn't know what I was doing. I just sat down to write. I started out writing Saturdays and Sundays from like 9 to noon, and ended up banging out this weird little book about a guy who collects the souls of the damned and delivers them to hell.
And this is you talked about the series a few times, the collector series.
This is my collector series.
Yeah.
And so I was just flying blind. I was a science nerd who thought, hey, maybe I'll try and write a novel. And then when I landed an agent for it, she wasn't really the type to give a lot of notes. And then she sold it to an editor who, quite frankly, seemed as though he might have proofread it before it went to publishing, but went to printing, but that was about it. And so I thought, it's flattering the first time you hear, what, this is perfect. It doesn't need a single thing.
Mm-hmm.
The third or fourth time you hear that, you're like, come on, I know I could do better than this if I had a little guidance.
Mm-hmm.
I know this book could be better. It's just as good as I can make it on my own.
Mm-hmm.
So I went and targeted agents when I was looking for them that were known for a strong editorial hand.
Interesting.
And no good deed unpunished. David ended up selling it to an editor very much in his mold. So now I get my ass kicked on 2 separate rounds. I get beat up by my agent, and then I get beat up by my editor. But the good news is, by the time we're done, hopefully the book sings.
Yeah.
What's interesting, particularly within sort of the context of this podcast, is that David has a Hamilton connection. David Gerner, my agent, has a couple of Hamilton connections. In fact, his wife Nancy graduated from, I believe, Kirkland. I believe she graduated from Kirkland before they combined.
Okay.
And his son Jack, who is now also an agent, graduated from Hamilton a few years back.
Nice.
Yeah. And so what was really interesting to me was, I think, again, if I was known for anything when I was querying that, it was, punchy, actiony sort of stories.
Mm-hmm.
And David said that the first chapter that really grabbed him and made him sort of sit up and take notice in The Killing Kind was the one in which I describe the old train station, which is now mostly a bus station in Utica. And he said,
Chris, it's in my notes to talk to you about that.
Yeah. And it was really fascinating. He's like, I've been there. He said, and it's one of the most surreal places I've ever seen, because it's this beautiful marvel of architecture in a decaying industrial town in upstate New York. It's fascinating.
Yep.
And he thought, okay, maybe this kid knows what he's doing, because he hooked me on a quiet scene.
That's funny. That's really interesting. That's really interesting. Are there other? So I had my notes. I caught the Utica station scene. I too have been there. My first my first year plus at Hamilton, I would take the train back and forth to. I grew up on Long Island, so I would take the train
Hmm.
from New York up to Utica, and the or the bus sometimes, which was
Hmm.
quite an experience.
I would
Uh,
imagine so.
I would
Not a lot of people catch a bus to Utica because their life is going well. You know?
having lived through some bus rides, that is an accurate statement. That is an accurate
Yeah.
statement. Some good characters for future books, I'll tell you though.
Yes, I would imagine.
But that, and certainly, you write about Portland, which I know is home for you.
Hmm.
Are there how many other personal experiences or things about yourself you're sprinkling into either of these series?
Oh gosh. So I can tell you, I get a little closer to Hamilton in the second in the Michael Hendricks series, the sequel to The Killing Kind.
Okay.
In Red Right Hand, uh, one of the characters, the character who appeared at the train station in Utica, there are a couple of scenes in his home, and I put him in one of those kind of peculiar Tudor style houses that you see around Clinton. Um, and what was funny about that was I got a little joking pushback from the person who runs the alumni bookshelf uh, in the alumni review, saying, you're giving us a bad name putting all these gangsters in Clinton, New York. Uh, but yeah, I couldn't help that. I also, there was I'm trying to recall. Um, I grew up in upstate New York.
Uh-huh.
I grew up about a half an hour north of Syracuse, and so upstate New York is peppered throughout a lot of my writing because it's such a peculiar place. It's such a unique place. It's kind of geographically and culturally isolated. The communities are very insular,
Yeah.
and it's just what I know. So I definitely pepper a lot of my short stories with sort of the small towns in upstate New York. Uh,
And then are you a weapons expert? I was starting to get scared reading that book, getting prepared to talk to you. Like this guy's got some scary knowledge and how to kill people.
the funny thing about that, no, I am not. In fact, there's sort of this old saw in crime fiction that crime novelists, sort of the literary guys, your George Pelicanos, your Dennis Lehane, are a fairly liberal bunch, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're writing about not sort of the whodunit, but sort of the cultural, factors that go into a life of crime. They have a lot of sympathy for their antagonists, and that thriller writers are typically very conservative. These are the guys who often have military backgrounds and
Mm-hmm.
uh, enjoy going out and blowing things up on the weekends. I am definitely not that, but what I am is a bit of a research nut, and what I can tell you is, in this country, if you want to know about guns, it is very, very easy to do so. The thing that always blows me away is you can find just about anything on YouTube. You can find, if you want to know how far a 22 round will penetrate through solid oak, somebody has filmed themselves doing exactly that on YouTube. If you want to find out how to suture yourself, using things you find around your house, somebody has done that on YouTube. So I do have some gun background. I'm my family on my mom's side is a cop family.
Mm-hmm.
So I grew up around guns. My father hunted. He used to drag me out hunting. I just thought it was I don't know, waking up before dawn and covering myself in deer urine doesn't sound like my idea of a good time. But
Uh-huh.
but I've shot, I've shot skeet. I've shot my share of shotguns. And once, when I think maybe 13 years old, my cousin Joey and I were brought to the public safety building in Syracuse by my grandfather for a surprise. And it turns out that surprise was he had set up. He introduced us to the head of the Syracuse SWAT team, who brought us down to the gun range to fire some stuff, because of course we were teenage boys. We thought it was the coolest thing in the
Of
world.
course, sure.
And we started with your 9mm, your 357, and then he was like, "You want to see some cool stuff?" And as it turns out, they once when they've confiscated weapons in busts, once those weapons are cleared after the trials are over and stuff, they get to use them for training purposes. So I actually got to shoot a suppressed MAC-10 fully automatic, which was one hell of an experience. And then I got to see him shoot a semi-automatic shotgun, which I didn't even know existed. It actually, I mean, it looks like a Gatling gun. It's got this rotating barrel thing. It's crazy. He wouldn't let us touch that. Quite rightly. See, I've got a little bit of real life experience, and then I've got an awful lot of research behind it. And occasionally, I will get. In fact, you could go on Amazon and look at a review of The Killing Kind, where a woman who gave me a very lovely review. I'm not bagging on the review. Said, "Do you love guns?" Well, I don't, but it's clear that Chris Holm does, and boy, did I learn a lot about them. And I was like, I'm honored that she thinks I am a firearms enthusiast, because that means I did my job right. But
right. Boy, your data profile on Google, they got you all wrong, I'm sure, in terms of what they think you like.
Oh, I am certain that's true. I every once in a while, because as if The Killing Kind weren't bad enough, and for the people listening, The Killing Kind is about a hitman who only kills other hitmen. And so obviously I'm researching a lot to do with, murder. But as if that weren't bad enough, in the second book, there's actually a major terror attack on U.S. soil.
You're on a watch list for sure.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And so I'm researching terror organizations, and I'm researching private military organizations, and improvised explosive devices. I'm on a lot of lists, and it's gotten to the point that when our internet slows down at home, my wife and I curse the NSA. We're like, God damn, again. Every once in a while I will just type into Google, like, I promise I am an author doing research. Just hit enter just in case. I'm sure they've realized I'm harmless at this point. I'm on like I'm on all these crazy chat rooms and stuff, reading up on firearms, and then I'm, playing 8-bit video games in another window at the same time, playing.
Well, I think that actually probably fits the profile, Chris. Let's be honest.
That's probably true. That's probably true. Which is why it's a big relief, honestly, that I am now published, because when I was doing this,
before you can point this right.
I was just a lunatic who was, Google and all this stuff. Now at least I have a website. They can say, okay, this fellow writes books.
He checks out. That's funny. And the gun bit. I have a good friend, a Hamilton friend, who I won't out here, but is as liberal as they come, and as anti-gun, as gun control as you'll ever meet. But he told me about a time he went to the big gun range in Las Vegas, and he said, I'm all for gun control and we should ban these things, but man, you fire an AK-47, there's nothing like it.
That's actually something that I talk about a lot when I'm on writing panels and stuff. I genuinely believe that there are responsible gun owners in this country. I grew up with them. I mean, my grandfather would he could put his gun on top of the television, and his 7 kids and God knows how many grandkids knew not to touch that weapon. That wasn't maybe the best place to put it, but right. I've seen people, raised around guns that they're not sociopaths, they're not dangerous, but I do think everyone should fire a gun at least once, because you need to understand, if you ever come face to face with someone who has a gun pointed at you, exactly what that feels like, because it does feel dangerously powerful. I actually personally do not care for having them around. We don't have a gun in our house. I would not be comfortable with somebody bringing a gun into my home.
Sure.
But that's because, again, I'm a scientist by background. I'm not moved by emotional arguments so much as statistics, and the statistics are pretty darn clear that it's not a great idea to keep a gun in your home.
Right. Right.
But yeah, I think it is. It's very potent. It's very powerful. And as much as I hate to say it, it's also occasionally a hell of a lot of fun. I've been skeet shooting. That's if you'll pardon the pun, a blast. It's a great time.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit more about that science background. Because it's easy to assume, oh, he's a Hamilton grad and now he's an author, so he's going to tell the story that I became a great writer at Hamilton, or I felt, I learned how to write at Hamilton, and off I went.
Hmm.
But since you're come from a science background, I'm not judging what your writing skills were like at Hamilton, but I imagine it wasn't. It was a slightly different path for you, clearly.
I mean, yes and no. Uh, you know, so I grew up in a small town called Central Square, New York,
Mm-hmm.
which is not central to anything and has no square of which I am aware. Um, a very small town, but it actually is, at least according to my understanding, the largest geographic school district in New York State. So I went to
Hmm.
a high school that was larger than Hamilton, but it was
Mm-hmm.
this giant spread out rural school district, very poor. Um, that it was in Oswego County. For anyone who's ever been to Oswego County, they that conjures a picture in their mind. Um, and I was from a fairly working class background. I'm not the first person from my family to go to college, but I'm pretty darn close.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and my educational experience prior to Hamilton was was a very poor public school. And I remember meeting uh, with my guidance counselor uh, to talk about colleges, and it was the strangest conversation. I'm not sure how this person. It was such a scam. This person got paid a salary to do what they did, because as near as I could tell, they had two tracks. If you were halfway bright, you they pointed you towards Syracuse University, which was sort of the dominant, you know, had a lot of gravity in upstate New York,
Sure. Yeah.
and if you were interested in a trade or maybe you weren't an A student, they would point you toward Oswego County Community College.
Mm-hmm.
And I'd been getting the brochures the same as anybody who was a half decent student, and I was like, I didn't actually know what a liberal arts college was, but I knew that like I'd gotten a few of these things. It sounded really interesting and
Mm-hmm.
completely different from these big faceless 300 student classes. And so I said I said to my guidance counselor, actually I was thinking of someplace a little smaller than Syracuse. And he fell silent for a while and then said, you mean like Lemoyne, which was a Jesuit school in Syracuse? And I was like, no. um, and I had these visions of kind of running away, far away from upstate New York, and going to California or New York City or somewhere to escape where I'd grown up. And then I went for a tour. My dad actually insisted. We'd gotten Hamilton's brochures, and he said, at least go take a look. You
Uh-huh.
liked it enough to be to kind of put it in your maybe pile. Um, at least go take a look. And I remember when I showed up for that tour, uh, this is actually a recurring theme I've noticed on this particular show. It was a beautiful day when I went on that tour, a beautiful sunny day. But I remember walking around the campus and thinking, darn it, like I think I love this place. Like I just fell in love with it. I for whatever reason.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and I think my science major came from the fact that when I was in fourth grade, I got put into an advanced program that led to advanced science classes in middle school and high school that led to college credits. They didn't do AP in my high school, but it was the same basic deal. So I came into Hamilton with a bunch of science under my belt.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think in retrospect that one of the reasons a place like Hamilton appealed so strongly was because I wasn't expected to only take science. Because I started out a biochemistry major. Um, Organic chemistry cured me of that pretty quickly. Uh, I can remember I I was I was poking around doing some research before we chatted, just to kind of refresh my memory for all these classes and professors that were 20 years ago.
Mm.
Um, I can remember organic chemistry 2. Uh, Ian Rosenstein, who I believe still teaches at Hamilton, was a professor. And I was not a guy who went to office hours and asked a ton of questions. I was invisible. I really was not the person who like called a lot of attention to themselves in class. But I bugged him relentlessly because I just was not getting the material.
Hmm.
And I can remember one test, I got the lowest grade I had ever gotten in my life to that point, which was a D plus. And that plus cracked me up because it was basically like, look, I know you're trying. I'm aware that you're making an effort, but you are not getting this. And I was like, okay, maybe I shouldn't be a biochemist.
Hmm.
But so I switched to biology largely because there were fewer credits required. And I, like everybody who took biology in Hamilton, thought I was going to be a doctor
Uh-huh.
because my parents wanted me to be a doctor, and it sounded like a fancy thing to be. And you're doing good and all that stuff. But meanwhile, I was taking tons of English courses. I was taking tons of art courses. I think I had enough of each to minor in them. I just didn't take the right courses. Um, I fell in love with philosophy, ended up with a philosophy minor. My parents were not thrilled about that.
Interesting.
And yeah, so I was on this other path entirely, but I genuinely think I got to Hamilton on the strength of my writing. When I was when I was applying, my writing was always favorably graded at Hamilton, and I just wasn't taking the hint.
Mm.
I was struggling in science and crushing it when I was taking writing intensive courses.
Oh, that's
Um,
interesting.
yeah. One of my best friends while I was there, Sarah Smith, also from class of '99, was a French major, took nothing but languages, and then when we took the GREs, she crushed me in the science portion, and I crushed her in the language portion, and now she has a PhD in science. So but yeah, so I graduated, and I had fallen in love with microbiology at Hamilton because there was a really passionate professor there, a woman by the name of Susan Morgan, who just I found inspiring. Um, and by then I was like, med school might not be for me because I have too many other interests. But I actually applied to and got into a PhD program in microbiology. I was going to be like a bug hunter for the CDC. That was my goal.
Interesting.
Uh, and I was miserable. I hated it. I hated everything about the program, despite it being an amazing program. Um,
Because you realized that that wasn't for you, or what weren't
yeah,
you
I
liking
think I
about it?
think that was exactly it. I just felt like I was being um, I felt like I was getting pet the wrong way. It was like, just this like visceral, like no response to this,
Huh. Yeah.
Um, and I remember my wife, also a Hamilton grad, Katrina Needus Holm,
Mhm.
class of '99. Um, she was like, if you're so unhappy, why wouldn't you just quit, do something else? And I had said, well, I kind of aped my dad and was like, Holmes don't quit. And she took my last name but kept her own and didn't hyphenate, and so we always joke that we're space Holmes because we both have a space and a home. She's like, maybe space Holmes quit when they feel like it. And that was the best advice I think I'd ever gotten. um, and God help her, she said, well, what would you do if you weren't doing this? And I said, I
Yeah.
always thought I'd write a novel one day. And she was like, well, maybe get a day job first, but try that.
Yeah.
And that's essentially what happened. It took a good 6 or 7 years after that decision to find myself in print, but that was what set me on that path.
It's a good life lesson, right? Is make the leap and
Yeah,
try to find the thing that you really want to do. Yeah.
yeah. And I think what's interesting about a place like Hamilton, especially coming from the sort of background I came up in, is I just remember when I was first on campus and I realized that the academic buildings were unlocked at all hours of the day, and I could go in and work on what I wanted to work on at 3 in the morning, and that was acceptable. That was fine.
Hmm.
That level of trust, that level of you know, we we don't think you're just going to steal things. You're here to work. You're here to learn.
Right.
And the people who were brought to campus, I remember seeing a woman whose name is Ultraviolet. She paints under the name Ultraviolet. She was a part of Andy Warhol's factory back in the
Mhm.
day. Came to give a talk on her art. You always had these really fascinating people coming it was a place that taught somebody like me that these crazy things are done by normal people. These, well, maybe not Ultraviolet. She's not the best example of normal people, but you know, that that the writers of the world, the actors of the world, the comedians, the whatever, um, that they just made a choice to do it,
Hmm.
and they had the
Hmm.
support to do it. Um, I think even though I didn't study writing at Hamilton, that sense of sort of self-confidence and self-worth and just seeing that it's possible to get there from where I am is a powerful thing. I think it's a very cool thing.
Yeah, for sure. And that you mentioned people coming to Hamilton. That was one of the things I distinctly remember. I took a film class,
Mhm.
and one evening we had to go see one of the films that they were showing as part of the films that they would showcase in the I guess it was in the KJ auditorium.
Mhm.
And I remember there's a woman sitting in front of me who she may have been a professor. She may have been a local who just came to see this free movie that Hamilton College was showing. And it was, it may have been Citizen Kane or something along those lines. It was a
Mhm.
classic film. And I remember thinking, like, who the hell is this woman? Like, I have to be here. I enjoyed the films and it was there, but like, I had to be there. It was an
Mhm.
assignment for class. And like, here's this woman just sitting here enjoying this movie, and she cracked open a beer, which I was like, wait, you can't do that in here. Like, you can do that. That's amazing. It's just this woman's got guts. But then it dawned on me, like, oh no, this is a thing that's available to people to come see, and
Mhm.
that's what I was like, right. And we have concerts and comedians and so forth, and
Mhm.
it's easy to take that for granted, and that's sort of the inspiration that can give you while you're there.
It's awfully easy to take that for granted,
Yeah,
and I think I probably to an extent did
sure.
take some of it for granted. I can tell you the flip side of that story is Katrina had to go see. It was a Thursday or a Friday night, and for one of her classes, they were screening The Deer Hunter,
Mm,
which classic film. I'd never seen it. I just knew that it was a classic, and I was like, you know what, I'll go with you. And we had a party to go to, not that long after.
yeah.
And for those who aren't familiar with The Deer Hunter, it is
Put you in a
maybe
different headspace.
yeah, it is one of the most depressing movies I've ever seen in my life. And so we like stumbled out of that movie and went to this party and just sort of sat shell shocked in the corner, trying to process what we'd seen.
Yeah,
So I guess it cuts both ways, but
that's right. That's right. And now you gotta tell me about the new book that's coming.
oh gosh. So it's funny. Um, there are two weird things that happen when I have to go and do promo stuff, and that is that one, whenever somebody invites me on for a specific book, like for example, you've just recently
Hmm.
read The Killing Kind.
Hmm.
I started writing The Killing Kind in I don't know 2012,
Hmm.
2013. So to me, uh, it's ancient history. And then on the flip side of that, um, so I'm trying to remember the characters and the beats and not spoil anything from the second book, stuff like that.
Sure.
And then when it comes to a new book, um, like the one that I have coming out next year, uh, it's so new and so fresh that I become a complete idiot when it comes to talking about it. Uh, so, what I can tell you is it's called Child Zero. That was not its title for most of its life, so I'm still adjusting to it. But I like it very much. I like the title. I think it's
Is that
punchy.
title? Is that a note that you got to change the title?
So it was a discussion that I had with my agent and editor.
Uh-huh.
Originally, it was called End Times, one word. Um, and I think the objection there was that it was a little biblical sounding.
Hmm.
Whereas this book, finally, I am putting my science degree to good use in my writing life. Science kept the lights on for 14 or 15 years after college, but it really didn't often find its way into my work. Um, this is the first time where I'm actually writing a thriller that contains some science. It is science fiction in the sense that it is scientific and it's fiction, but it's not like a sci-fi novel.
Hmm.
It's more like a Michael Crichton novel.
Hmm.
Like Jurassic Park is sci-fi, but it was a mainstream thriller. Uh, and it was very much sort of my conscious homage to his sort of big high concept thrillers, but filtered through my uh, interest in infectious disease research. Um,
Mm.
so this book exists at the intersection of two separate things that fascinate me. One of them is the impending threat of a post-antibiotic era, uh, which we are on the precipice of. If you were to Google post-antibiotic era, you're going to get 150,000 news hits from places like the BBC, Wired, NPR. Um, and yet, I think it's something that people have a tough time visualizing or understanding the danger of. We're being warned by experts that it's coming, that antibiotic resistance is growing, and
Mm.
that eventually our antibiotics are going to stop working,
Mm.
right? But I think people think, well, how often do I take antibiotics? Really, not that often. It's no big deal. Um, the problem with that logic is, I'll tell you when you take antibiotics, whenever you have surgery,
Mm-hmm.
for one.
Mm-hmm.
So that means any kind of major surgery is off the table, including any kind of implant, be it a heart implant, a knee implant or a hip, um, anything cosmetic, obviously. Uh, Before antibiotics existed, pneumonia was the second leading cause of death in the United States. That's going to happen again. Before antibiotics, tuberculosis was a death sentence. That will come surging back
Mm-hmm.
when antibiotics leave. But maybe the biggest impact is going to be on our food supply, right? Because like the by far the largest amount of antibiotics used on the planet is in livestock,
Mm.
and without it, we aren't going to be able to keep up the level of production we currently have. So you're going to
Mm-hmm.
see major food shortages, which is going to lead to all kinds of geopolitical skirmishes. There are tons of ripple effects that come from a failure of our antibiotics,
Mm-hmm.
and it used to be we thought, and we were told this as recently as when we were younger. Um, you have to take your full course of antibiotics because if you don't take it all, it
Right.
knocks out most of the bug,
Right.
and then the rest of it comes surging back, and that's how you get resistance.
Right.
It turns out that's only part of how it works. What really happens to create antibiotic resistance is that just like humans, bacteria are susceptible to viruses. But unlike humans, the viruses that affect bacteria take little bits of DNA out of one bacterium and then end up injecting it into another. And through that process, which is like bees cross pollinating flowers, if one bacteria bumps into an antibiotic and lives, it can teach any other bacteria on the planet to do the same thing. So it's a really terrifying scenario where it's basically like it's contagious resistance, which is scary to me. So I wanted to write a story that painted a picture not of an apocalypse, because I don't think it's that, but of what the world would look like 3, 4, or 5 years after these dominoes started to fall.
Mm.
Um, because I think if people have a sense of how scary that can be, we have a chance of doing something about it. And then the other element that kind of came into Child Zero was we're now discovering that the people call it the microbiome a lot. You hear microbiome. I don't know if you're familiar with the term,
Mm-hmm.
a lot in the media, which is actually kind of a misnomer. But basically, the concept is all humans have lots of critters that live in, on, and around us,
Mm-hmm.
right? And for the longest time, we just thought they were freeloaders. They were just coming along for the ride. But now we know that they play a major role. They actually outnumber our own cells, and they can do crazy stuff like affect your thoughts, or your weight, or your ability to withstand infection. And so I had this idea. I was picturing this world in which antibiotics don't work anymore, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I was picturing, well, the same viruses that supercharged the bad bacteria could supercharge the good bacteria. What happens? Like imagine what every government and every major drug company would do to get their hands on the next big cure.
Mm-hmm.
Now imagine if that next big cure were a person. And that was the premise for Child Zero.
Huh.
Is what if this miracle cure that everyone's after, that everybody wants to take apart and see how it works, is an 11-year-old boy? And so that to me was a fascinating concept, and it allowed me to explore all kinds of stuff, um, about sort of um, race and medicine and public policy, and all kinds of things about individual human agency versus what's good for the whole. Um, so that's my big sloppy pitch for what this book is going to be about when it
I,
actually finally comes out.
I love it. And where are you in the process right now with it?
So it took me, because I was so obsessed with getting every detail of the science right. It took me about 4.5 years to write. I finished the first draft in December of last year,
Wow.
and then COVID hit. And suddenly, a lot of this purely speculative stuff I'd been writing started to look very, very real in terms of, the world I was building, the people going around in masks, the threat of infection, um, which made for a really weird time to try and sell that book to publishers. You're like, no, it'll be huge, I promise. Once people are done being terrified of COVID. Um, and thankfully, I mean, this is very much a thriller. It's actually the most action oriented thing I've ever written. There's no like long, boring science monologues and stuff. This is about everyday people living in this world. It's not like a nerdy science lesson. And so thankfully, my agent kind of he saw my vision for it and really pushed me to make it as big and epic as I could. And then my editor fell in love with it. So I've actually done all those edits I talked about with my agent giving me that one more draft. We
Yeah.
went through 6 or 7 of those with this one too,
Yeah.
and then I think I did 2 or 3 with my editor, and now it's slated for publication. I think currently we're expecting it to be out in May of next year. Um, but yeah, it's full steam ahead. It's got a publisher. It's going to be hopefully a pretty big release, and yeah,
That's
now
awesome. So
now I'm just
not a nerdy science lesson, but I mean, I imagine you put some nerdy science stuff in there,
yeah. I mean, well, yeah, but it's you got to put in some explosions to make that go down a little easier.
huh?
But no, I very much so. As a kid, I read a lot of thrillers, and I loved Michael Crichton. I just thought made science fun.
Uh-huh.
I mean,
Uh-huh.
you just you know trying to teach people about DNA, that's kind of a non-starter. Trying to teach people about DNA with dinosaurs, brilliant. You know,
Right.
once you put the dinosaurs in there, everybody wants in. So that was what I wanted to do, is like to write a book that maybe only I could write, because I had the thriller writing experience, but also the science geekery to sort of digest this stuff and make it palatable for a mass audience.
That's interesting.
I
That's
don't know.
interesting.
Or maybe I'm just flattering myself. We'll see.
Oh, it sounds awesome. And you'll have some sort of movie under your belt by then. This one will be ready, and this one will
There
be
you
the
go.
next big one, and then off you go. It's a whole new brand for you.
There you go.
I love it. So I got to ask you the question I ask everybody. If you think
Mhm.
back, breaking through the mold of either community college or Syracuse University and going to Hamilton, when you got there and thinking of all your experiences, anything you wish you had known?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this actually. By the way, I've become a big fan of the podcast. I listened to several, and they've been fascinating. And one through line I've seen with this question is a lot of people talk about insecurity when they were younger.
Yep.
And I suppose like everybody, I've got a bit of that. Uh, but to drill down and be more specific about it, uh, first of all, I'm not sure I'd tell the dope that I was at 17 when I decided to go to Hamilton much of anything, because despite his best efforts, things have worked out beautifully. I've got my dream job. I'm,
Mhm.
happily married. I live in a beautiful place. Um, so I'm a little disinclined to give him any tips for fear he'll screw it up. Uh, but I think the one thing that it took me a long time to internalize, and I suspect other Hamiltonians listening to this will appreciate where I'm coming from is I was a high achieving kid. I was a straight A kid. I I was decent at athletics. I did the stuff you were supposed to do to get to a good school. Um, but in so doing, I think I developed this allergy to failure. I was terrified of failing at anything.
Hmm.
Um, because, and I wish academically we would come up with a different term for an F than failure, because what I wish was that I was just not so afraid to fail at that age, because failure is how you learn. I would not have ended up where I am had I not started down the wrong path and had to come to grips with the fact that this thing that I thought I wanted to do isn't what I wanted to do. A lot of the best things that have happened to me have happened virtually by accident, because I tried something that I could have easily failed at. And I think failure, is freeing in a way. Learning that you can fail at something and get back up. Once you learn that, that's a superpower. Once you're not afraid of looking stupid, that's a superpower. When I got to Hamilton, I, as a lower middle class public school kid, I definitely was very concerned with not looking like I belonged. And so I would fake my way through a lot of conversations. And that's a great way not to learn much of anything, pretending you know that band, pretending you know that book.
Yeah.
And I've since realized a lot of the smartest people I've ever met are the ones who are willing to say, I have no idea what that is. Tell me all about it.
Right.
I wish I was that kid when I got there. I wish I wish I had bad, cringeworthy poetry to look back on from the Lit Mag days, and just be like, oh God, I can't believe I wrote that. Put it out in the world. I wish I'd taken more advantage of some of the stuff that was offered,
right,
that I was just too scared to jump at.
All right, that's Chris Holm, class of '99. I really enjoyed that one. And I really did enjoy The Killing Kind, and I'm looking forward to reading the rest of his work. And I'm definitely going to pick up his new one, Child Zero, which you can pre-order on Amazon, Apple Books, Barnes & Noble, Google Play, wherever you get books. You can pre-order it. You can get the link in the show notes here to get it for yourself. My thanks to Chris for joining this week. And my thanks to my new, what are we calling them? My new associate producers, Maeve and Devin. You've been listening to Had I Known at WHCL-FM, Clinton, New York. HadIKnown.buzzsprout.com. Had I Known Show on social media, which Maeve and Devin are going to make a hell of a lot better for you. As always, my thanks to Dr. Michael Woods for supplying the music on this show, including what you're listening to right now. You can listen to that on the way out. Hope you enjoyed the show. Talk to you next week.
Had I Known podcast show on your radio or take it to go.